You are listening to Mangoes and Malice, a full culinary cozy mystery audiobook by Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Byne. This is part 2 of 4 parts.
Mangoes and Malice, a Wailuku Town Cozy Mystery by Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Byne. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Chapter 10. I was still standing there in the tiny entry of the cottage, trying to wrap my mind around the fact that someone had stolen Alma Tanaka's hate mail, probably right from under my nose, when the alarm I'd recently set on the mailbox gave one wild squeal that abruptly cut off shortly after it started. I rushed out to the street where I found 148C's mailbox hanging open, the door dangling from only one hinge. There was a significant dent in the top of the mailbox. Whoever had tripped the alarm hadn't done so by opening the mailbox in the usual manner. Of that, I was sure. Someone, and I was suddenly confident as to that miscreant's identity, had instead heaved a rock at the mailbox, knocking it open and setting off the alarm. The rock in question lay several feet away in the street. This act could hardly be regarded as an additional warning to Mrs. Tanaka. It was a warning to me. Based on the location of the hit and where the rock now lay, I was highly suspicious that the stone had been tossed from the roof of the house. But I didn't bother looking on the roof now. Whoever had been up on the roof had no doubt scrambled down and was safely away. I kicked the rock out of the street, removed the remains of the alarm, and tried to shut the mailbox in vain. It was too bent to close properly. I did not bother knocking on the door of 148A. I knew the guilty party was hiding inside, but I bided my time by sitting on the steps of the tiny front porch of my cottage and belatedly tackling the first chapters of the book club selection. When I heard a pickup pull up at the curb, I waited another 5 minutes, then went to the A side of the duplex and knocked, a pint of Mango Madness ice cream I'd brought home with me in hand. Dan answered right away. "I'm sorry we haven't met yet," I told him. "You must be Dan." "I'm Nate's mother, Cynthia. I'm sure you've heard I'll be staying at Nate and Harmony's place for the time being." I held out the pint of ice cream. Dan thanked me and took it. "Would you like to come in?" he asked. I did, and I didn't. I might have come bearing gifts, but what I had to say was going to get highly unpleasant. "I'm not here just to introduce myself," I said. "Oh? You need help with something?" I did need help with something, but it probably wasn't the sort of thing Dan was expecting. Dan was much like his twin, large and with an amiable demeanor. He was likely in the habit of doing all manner of little handyman favors for his single lady neighbors of a certain age. Unfortunately, what I had in mind was considerably less pleasant than changing a light bulb or adjusting the heat setting on the water heater. "I'm afraid what I have to say isn't going to be very pleasant to hear," I said. "Oh? It's about Zoe," I said. "Perhaps you should call her in." Dan called out for Zoe. She failed to emerge, and Dan finally had to go to the door of her room and knock. When Dan's daughter finally came out, her expression was an incongruous mix of terrified and defiant. Zoe knew I knew. I imagined she was hoping, fruitlessly, that I wouldn't voice my suspicions of what she'd been up to aloud in the presence of her father. "I believe you have some things that belong to Auntie Alma," I said after Dan had nudged Zoe forward to introduce herself and shake my hand. "I don't have anything of Auntie Alma's," Zoe insisted. Technically, the ownership of that stack of notes was legally ambiguous. There had been major court battles over whether or not collections of old letters belonged to the estates of the senders or to the estates of the recipients. However, in this case, both the sender of the notes and the recipient were still very much alive and kicking. Also, it was not so much the ownership of the notes that I wanted to establish. It was that Zoe had them in her possession. "My Zoe don't steal," said Dan. "Tell Auntie Cynthia that you don't steal." He turned to Zoe. Dan seemed like a good dad. He had faith in his daughter, but not so much faith that no matter the evidence, he'd refuse to acknowledge if that daughter had done wrong. I suddenly felt a pang of pity for Dan. It was a painful experience to have one's child accused of a crime. I should know. "It's not a question of stealing," I said. "What are you talking about, then?" Dan demanded. He was getting a little indignant. I didn't blame him. "You know those threatening notes Auntie Alma's been getting for a while?" I asked. "Yeah." Poor Dan didn't know what was about to hit him. However, the blanched look on Zoe's face revealed that she very much did. The kid was shaking in her customized Converse. "Do you know who's been sending them?" I asked. "Auntie Alma thought it was Auntie Grace," Dan said. "Something about a prank with some cake, but it don't seem like Auntie Grace to do something like that. You know Grace Chang?" "We all go to church together," Dan said. This was an interesting tidbit of information, but probably not relevant. "Well, it's not Grace who's been sending them," I said. "It's Zoe." "Zoe? Zoe." Zoe said nothing to defend herself, but Dan did. "That's crazy talk." "I wish it was, but it isn't," I said. "If you go look in Zoe's room right now, you'll probably find a whole stack of those notes to Auntie Alma that Zoe just sneaked from the tote bag I left on my front porch." I didn't bring up the alarm or the smashed mailbox. I didn't want to muddy the waters. I also didn't say Dan would find those notes in Zoe's room. The notes might be in Zoe's room, or they might be buried in the trash bin outside, or they might be chucked under the shed. Hopefully, Zoe hadn't yet had time to rip them up and flush them down the toilet. If Dan didn't find them in Zoe's room, I was prepared to continue the search for those notes until they turned up. I refused to stand idly by while a spoiled child terrorized an old woman. I was hopeful the notes were in Zoe's room, however. It would be less of a struggle for Dan to believe my accusations that way. It turned out that they were where I said they would be. Zoe went and got them herself. She threw the stack of notes down in the middle of their little kitchen table and maintained a stony silence while she looked at her feet. "Is what Auntie Cynthia is saying true?" Dan asked his daughter. "Did you really write these?" Zoe didn't confess or deny it. "Why would you want to terrorize Auntie Alma?" I asked. "I just don't get it, Zoe." "I had my reasons," Zoe said, which was as close to a confession as I expected to get. That was when I remembered the drawing I'd picked up from the ground the day Zoe had dropped her notebook as she'd left the house. Z plus Z. There weren't that many Z names around. Zoe was a couple of years younger than Ziggy, but they'd likely gone to the same high school until Ziggy's recent graduation. "Is this about Ziggy?" I asked. "Is this because Auntie Alma got Ziggy in trouble with the police?" Chapter 11. "Who's Ziggy?" Dan asked before his daughter even had a chance to reply. "She killed his dream," Zoe spat out before she totally lost it and started crying. It wasn't just any crying either. It was great, big, shoulder-shaking sobs. "Who's Ziggy?" Dan repeated as he patted his daughter awkwardly on the shoulder. "I think Ziggy is a boy she knows," I said. To be accurate, I should have told Dan that Ziggy was a boy that his daughter had a massive crush on, but that seemed unnecessarily cruel. I was starting to feel sorry for Zoe, even if she had been harassing Mrs. Tanaka for weeks. "What do you mean Auntie Alma killed Ziggy's dream?" I asked. "He missed his interview," Zoe got out between sobs. "Interview?" I asked. "Who is Ziggy?" Dan repeated himself like a broken record. I had a feeling that Zoe hadn't had any boyfriends yet. At least not any Dan had known about, and he wasn't happy about his daughter getting this worked up over a boy. "His art school interview," Zoe managed to say between more hysterical crying. "You really wrote these?" Dan asked his daughter once more as he sifted through the stack of notes on the table. Zoe nodded. "I'm sorry," she blubbered. "Good. I'm glad you're sorry, said Dan, but I'm not the one who needs to hear those words. I took up the rear as Dan herded his daughter out the door to make a full confession and presumably a tearful apology to Auntie Alma. I went home, fed Ricks and Licks, watched a little TV, read some more of the book club selection, and went to bed early. I slept well for the first night in 2 months. The following day, as I was heading out for work, I met Alma on the street. She was examining her busted-up mailbox. "Sorry about that," I said. "Why should you be sorry?" she asked. "I just am. It's sort of my fault," I said. "I was the one—" "Why'd you make that poor girl confess?" Auntie Alma demanded. "You knew already? You knew all along?" "Of course I knew," said Alma. "It was so obvious." It hadn't been evident to the rest of us, but then Mrs. Tanaka had done everything in her power to keep us from finding out it was Zoe writing those notes. I couldn't for the life of me fathom why. "But you said it was Grace Chang who was writing you those nasty notes," I pointed out. "Why would Grace do a thing like that?" "Why'd you say it was Grace if you knew it wasn't?" "I had my reasons," Alma said. "I'd been hearing that a lot lately." "It painted Grace in a pretty bad light," I pointed out. "Oh, Grace doesn't care." Mrs. Tanaka started to laugh. "She suggested I say that." "She thinks it's hilarious. Besides, who in their right mind would believe an educated lady like Grace Chang would write notes littered with exclamation marks? Not to mention that spelling." Alma had a point. "But if people didn't know Grace," I said, "if anyone did believe my tall tale, I'll just call it getting even for the Easter Bake-a-thon Bundt cake disaster," Alma said firmly. Mrs. Tanaka had no intention of backing down, but I still wasn't following her logic in allowing Zoe to carry on with her hate mail campaign unchecked. "Even so," I said, making one last-ditch effort to understand Mrs. Tanaka's reasoning, "doesn't Zoe deserve—" "Weren't you ever young and outraged?" Auntie Alma asked. "And in love?" "That too." Mrs. Tanaka's question about whether I'd ever been young and outraged didn't feel like a question that needed answering. Of course, I had been young and outraged and in love once upon a time, although perhaps not simultaneously. It seemed Auntie Alma had been all those things too. Nate had described Alma as a tough old lady, but underneath all the bluster and the prickly exterior, she was a big old softy. "Did Ziggy really not get into art school because of getting arrested?" I couldn't resist asking. "Well, he did miss his interview, and I felt pretty bad about that," said Alma. "But they let him reschedule? He must have failed the interview." "No, he passed. He got accepted. But Ziggy told me he wasn't going to art school. He decided not to go of his own volition," Alma said. "Does Zoe know that?" I asked. "I don't think so." "Why didn't you just tell her that?" I asked. "If you knew that was why she was so angry?" "Maybe I just like getting extra mail," Alma said. "Zoe is quite a creative girl, even if she couldn't spell to save her life." I suspected the real reason was far more complicated, but whatever convoluted line of thinking had brought Alma Tanaka to the conclusion that Zoe was better left in the dark about the real reason Ziggy wasn't going to art school wasn't going to be revealed to me by Auntie Alma herself. I decided to make one last effort to tie up the loose ends of the matter by asking Ziggy point blank why he'd opted out of art school. But when I got to Island Ice Cream, Ziggy wasn't at his grandfather's food truck. He'd gone over to Oahu, although Ed didn't volunteer why. While Veg Ed was helping me put up my awning, I asked, "I heard that Ziggy got accepted to art school, so why'd he decide not to go?" "He's in love," said Ed, "with Esther's daughter, Ellie." "Esther of Rita's Nails?" I asked, pointing to the business a few yards away. "Yep," said Ed. "He thinks they'll get married as soon as she gets back from beauty school." "Beauty school?" "Yeah, Ellie's training to cut hair in Honolulu until the end of the year." "You really think they'll get married?" "Ziggy's awfully young." Ed shrugged. "Probably not, but who knows? He and Ellie'll both be 18 by then, so it's not like anyone can stop them from doing what they want. Does Ziggy ever mention a girl named Zoe? I asked. Oh, sure. They were good friends for a while. Were good friends. Zoe was going to find out eventually that Ziggy felt about someone else the way she herself felt about him. However, Alma Tanaka refused to be the catalyst for Zoe's heartbreak. I felt a sudden rush of warmth for the woman. It lasted all day until I went home and found a note taped to the front door of my cottage. Stapled to the note was a receipt for a new mailbox. Please pay at your earliest convenience, the note accompanying the receipt read. And mind your own business. Chapter 12. On Sundays, Island Ice Cream didn't open until 1 in the afternoon, so I decided that it was the ideal opportunity to do what I should have done days ago. Pay a visit to Frank's filling station and see for myself where Frank Vatu had been shot in the abdomen and robbed of a pillowcase full of cash. Frank's filling station was less than a mile walk from Nate and Harmony's cottage in the oldest section of Wailuku town. When I arrived at the filling station, I wandered around the place under the watchful eye of who I'd later learn was Frank's niece. I filled a shopping basket as slowly as I could with random items from the small deli section of the tiny convenience store while I scanned the space and tried to picture what had happened the day of the holdup. Back outside with my bag of assorted snacks and bento boxes, I paused just around the side of the building and made a quick diagram of the interior. I had not pictured the place being so small. Frank had made the most of the space he had and packed in as much merchandise as possible, which had resulted in tall shelves and narrow aisles. It was easy to see, once I'd been in the place, how Nate and Harmony had managed to take cover behind the soda machine counter without the robbers realizing they weren't alone in the place. Every time I'd popped around a corner, the girl behind the register had been watching me. But that was probably because I could have stuffed half the contents of the shelves down my shirt front, and she wouldn't have known. The space behind the soda counter was currently blocked with cardboard boxes, which I assumed contained cups and straws and the like. Apparently, that had not been the case the day of the holdup. I added that to my list of questions I'd like to ask Nate. The small area in front of the checkout seemed hardly big enough to contain the prostrate body of a fully grown man, much less Nate and Harmony trying to render first aid. I'd also noted the location of the surveillance cameras. There were 4 now. I was pretty sure they'd all been upgraded since the holdup, and I had no doubt that if I'd attempted to abscond with my bento boxes, my cans of mushroom soup, or my wasabi peas without paying, I would have been caught on tape from multiple angles. Unfortunately for Nate and Harmony, the opposite had been the case on the day of the holdup. Unless I'd misunderstood, no footage existed of the interior of the station during the robbery. It was not until I'd finished diagramming the interior that I realized I'd made a major omission. Nate and Harmony had somehow escaped out the back of the station and into the alley when the robber had returned for his pillowcase full of money. I had no idea how they'd managed that. I went back inside and asked the girl behind the counter if I could relinquish my bag and use her restroom. "It's not really for customers," she said. "There's a potty at the park just down the street." "I really have to go," I pleaded, and did a little dance on the rubber mat in front of the counter to prove my point. "All right," she said, "but you'll have to go through the stockroom." She left her post long enough to point me through a door at the other end of the counter containing the soda fountain. I passed through a tiny stockroom stacked high with boxes and tripped over a mop bucket before coming to the bathroom. I could see why the girl had said it wasn't for customers. There was no door, just a shower curtain you had to pull across, and when I peeked inside, it looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a while. That didn't matter to me. The little dance had been a ruse. I turned on the light and pulled the curtain across before I pushed open the back door of the stockroom and looked out into the alley. I didn't step outside. I'd explore the alley later. I retraced my steps, flushed the toilet, ran my hands under the water, and emerged from the stockroom dramatically, waving my damp hands in the air to dry them. After I'd collected my shopping bag, I went back outside and skulked around the corner and into the alley behind the filling station. I'd gotten the impression that Nate and Harmony had taken cover behind the dumpster, so I did the same, although I was acutely aware that to anyone watching, I'd appear to have lost my marbles and the bag they came in. It was cramped and smelly, but far more appealing than getting gunned down by Richard Nixon. I emerged from behind the dumpster and stood there in the alley for another minute, shopping bag in hand, trying to decide what to do next. I'd never have made it as one of those door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesmen of my parents' generation, and the very thought of going up to people's houses with clipboard in hand to beg them to answer a survey or inquire after their eternal salvation makes me break out in hives. But that day I did something entirely out of character. I had no choice. As painful as it might be, I saw no other way forward. Somebody in that neighborhood might have seen something on the day of the holdup which could lead to the exoneration of Nate and Harmony. Unfortunately, the only way to find out if anyone had seen something was to ask. That meant knocking on one door at a time and explaining that I was the mother of a man accused of attempted murder. The first 2 doors I knocked on, no one answered. At the third house, which was painted in every color of the rainbow and had a front door entirely covered with the caps of old beer bottles, I finally got a response. Inside the house, I heard a commotion. A voice yelled, "Hello, hello!" in a screech of indeterminate gender, followed by a second voice, clearly a woman's this time, who yelled back, "Oh, shut up, you crazy old man." The first voice was screeching back that she should shut up and was adding some colorful, if not quite coherent, afterthoughts when a woman wearing a tie-dyed t-shirt as a dress and a collection of colorful plastic bangle bracelets on both arms flung open the door and said, "Don't mind Adonis, he hasn't had his breakfast yet." Then she stood there, expectantly, waiting for me to state my business while the voice of Adonis went on muttering in the background. I introduced myself as a neighbor, which was true in the sense that I lived within walking distance, and the woman told me her name was Pat and added on the usual "nice to meet you." "Did you hear about the robbery at Frank's filling station a few weeks ago?" I asked. "I heard about it from Laura," Pat told me. "Laura? Frank's niece. She works for Frank." I wondered if it had been Laura who had been at the filling station that morning, but it didn't seem particularly important, so I just asked Pat what she'd heard from Laura. "No more than you could have read in the paper," Pat said. "Why do you ask?" The moment of truth had come, so I told Pat everything. She took my big revelation that I was the mother of one of the accused in stride. "I don't have anything to go on," I said, "so I thought I'd ask the neighbors if they might have seen anything." "I didn't notice anything unusual on the morning it happened," Pat said, "but I did find something interesting in the alley." "Behind the filling station?" "No, behind my house." Pat was pointing through an open doorway into the room where the disgruntled voice of Adonis was still muttering away to himself and punctuating his grumblings with an occasional squawk. I thought at first that Pat intended to take me out back behind her house to the place where she'd found the objects in question, but instead she led me into the next room. I'd concluded shortly after Pat had given the voice a name that Adonis was not human, but even though I'd been expecting a bird, when Pat led me into the dining room where Adonis was sitting on his perch, I was still taken aback at his size. The huge multicolored parrot turned his head and looked at me with his right eye, then swiveled his head to examine me with his left. He'd broken off his grumbling to examine the stranger, me, and I found this silence considerably more disconcerting than his manic mumbling. "That bird is as gentle as a lamb," Pat said, "even if he does talk tough." "Of course," I said, and tried to stop picturing the parrot flapping down from his perch to land on my head. "That's what I found," Pat told me as she pointed to 2 objects she would later refer to as assemblage art pieces standing side by side in the corner of her dining room. I think the bizarre objects had begun life as two department store mannequins, one male and one female, but every square inch of their peach plastic skin had been resurfaced. Mr. Mannequin, much like Pat's front door, was covered largely with old bottle caps. Mrs. Mannequin was covered in a mosaic of seashells, bits of broken china, and plastic Mardi Gras coins. It was not the bodies of the mannequin couple that caught my attention, however. It was their faces. Mr. Mannequin was wearing a full-head pullover mask of Richard Nixon. Mrs. Mannequin was masquerading as Dolly Parton. "Oh," I said, "do the police know about this?" "I didn't think they'd be interested," Pat said. "That's what the robbers were wearing when they held up the place." Pat let out her breath with an audible whoosh. Maybe I should go down to the station and say something. There's no turning them in as evidence, though. I could see what she meant. The only way to turn those masks in as evidence would be to decapitate Mr. and Mrs. Mannequin and carry their heads to the police station. Is there any place in town where someone might be able to buy masks like that? I asked. Chapter 13. Asking if there was any place in town to buy masks was a long shot. These days you can get anything online, and ordering a pair of celebrity masks would be a simple matter of an internet connection and a credit card. "I don't think so," said Pat, "but I imagine whoever used them in the holdup got them from the library fundraiser sale." "What?" "I can't be sure, of course, that they are the same masks, but I remember seeing a Dolly Parton and a Richard Nixon mask at the library fundraiser sale. It was right as they were about to clean up what was left. One of the ladies helping with the sale was throwing stuff that hadn't sold into boxes. I remember she was joking around with another lady, saying that she might take the masks home with her." "What did the lady look like?" I asked. "Which lady?" "The one throwing unsold stuff into boxes." "She was a petite Asian lady." "How old?" "I'm not sure, but definitely past retirement age." "Do you remember anything else about her?" I asked. "She was dressed all in yellow." It had to be Alma Tanaka. She volunteered at the library, and I remembered her chiming into the discussion about the fundraiser the one time I'd participated in her book club. The physical description of the woman Pat had given might easily match half the Wailuku Town Library volunteer pool, but Mrs. Tanaka was the only person I'd ever met who consistently dressed entirely in nom. "You've been ever so helpful," I told Pat. "Can I leave you my number in case you think of anything else that might be pertinent to the case?" I left with Pat's number and an order for a gallon of peanut butter fudge ice cream on the house. I headed straight home in hopes of finding Auntie Alma. I had a feeling that, unlike the matter of Zoe's hate mail, she'd do anything within her power to help me find the couple who'd held up Frank's filling station. I was not wrong. When I knocked on Alma's front door, she answered right away, and when I told her I'd been going door to door in the neighborhood around Frank's, hoping to find some clue that might lead me to his assailants and exonerate my son, she invited me in and sat me down on her couch while she went off to her tiny kitchen to get me a glass of orange juice. Mrs. Tanaka liked to dress in one color from head to toe, and it appeared that she followed the same philosophy when it came to interior decor. The living room was decorated entirely in shades of green, and through the open door of the single bedroom on her half of the duplex, I could see that her bedroom was done in variations of pink. "Before you tell me what you found out from Frank's neighbor, maybe you could bring me up to speed on everything else. I don't actually know much at all about what happened," Alma said as she set the glass of juice down in front of me on the little fern-colored coffee table that was crammed in so close to the couch that I kept bumping it with my knees. I didn't know much about what had happened that day Frank was shot either. It seemed almost no one did. "What do you know?" I asked Alma. "I know that someone held up Frank's filling station while Frank was there alone. They got away with cash from the register, but they still shot Frank, which doesn't make sense to me. They already had the money." I hadn't really thought of that aspect of the incident, but now that Alma put it like that, it didn't make sense. After getting all their demands met, why had one of the robbers shot Frank on the way out the door? I don't know a great deal more than that, I said. Nate and Harmony were there when it happened, hiding behind the soda machine, but the most complete account I've had has been from Steve. Harmony's dad? Yes. Well, I'll go on record saying that there is no way Nate and Harmony had anything to do with it, said Alma. You learn a lot about people when they rent from you and live next door. Your son and his girlfriend wouldn't hold up a gas station. They certainly wouldn't shoot someone for no reason. Chapter 14. But whoever shot Frank must have had a reason, I said. Undoubtedly, said Alma, but one wonders if it had anything to do with the cash they made off with. One did wonder about that, but I'm a logical person, and I intended to start at a logical place with my investigation. The most reasonable explanation was that money was the motive. Maybe whoever had shot up Frank's filling station hadn't just been there to make a quick buck, but I had to rule that out before going off on wild tangents. Did you know that the robbers were wearing masks? I asked Alma. I vaguely remembered the news article saying that at the time. They'd have to have been for Nate and Harmony to get the blame. Wrong place, wrong time, I said. Did you know what kind of masks they were? I already knew what Alma's answer would be. No. The pair was disguised as Richard Nixon and Dolly Parton, I said. Alma, who'd brought out a glass of juice for herself, nearly dropped her tumbler. I wish I'd known, she said. A woman living a couple of blocks from the filling station found the masks discarded in the alley. She's since incorporated them into an art project, but when I saw them and questioned her about it, she says she remembers seeing the masks a few days before she found them abandoned in the alley. At the library fundraiser? Yes. We put those masks out on a table, but they didn't sell, Mrs. Tanaka told me. That's what Pat said. Pat? The lady who found them in the alley. What happened to the masks after they didn't sell? At the end of the day, we cleaned up the remains. I threw the masks into a box of stuff that was going to Goodwill. Then maybe the robbers bought the masks at Goodwill, I suggested. They didn't, said Alma. The masks were pretty beat up, and Grace said that Goodwill would just toss them, so we might as well trash them ourselves. So you did? I didn't. Grace was the one who threw them into a garbage bag with a bunch of other junk. What happened to the bag? There were 3 big bags of garbage after the sale. We don't have a dumpster at the library. We had the sale in the library parking lot, and Martin volunteered to take the bags of trash home with him. The same Martin that I met at book club? Yes, Martin Maxwell. He's an old friend of mine. And Grace's, I was betting. He's a library volunteer? I asked. He was just helping with the sale. Do you have Martin's number? After I'd filled Alma in on what little else I knew about the day Frank had been shot, I left with Martin's number. As soon as I was back in my little bungalow, I called him. He picked up on the second ring. This is Cynthia Rose. We met at book club last week. Oh, yes. Charming Cynthia. I had a sinking suspicion that Martin had a thing for younger women, or maybe he was just a compulsive flirt. Either way, I was leery of becoming the focus of his attention, not because Martin struck me as predatory, but because he was clearly the darling of the single over 70 set. And the last thing I wanted to do was get on the bad side of Alma, Grace, and company. However, I was not loath to take this opportunity to get Martin to talk. Those masks and who had ended up with them was the only concrete clue I had to track down Frank's shooter. I was wondering if you'd like to meet for coffee, I said. There was a real danger that Martin was going to misunderstand my reasons for wanting to meet for coffee, but I could gently set him straight later. Anytime, any place, said Martin. There was a little coffee shop about a block from Island Ice Cream, How about the perpetual grind on High Street at 7 this evening?" "I'll be there," said Martin. When I got to the perpetual grind, Martin was already waiting for me at a little table outside. He'd ordered for both of us something which might have impressed Alma or Grace as an old-fashioned gallant gesture, but he'd gotten me one of those fancy coffees with some Italian name that's half whipped cream and the other half sugar. It's not that I don't like sweets. It's that what with all the ice cream sampling, I was getting my fill of sucrose. I didn't dare risk offending Martin by ordering something else. There was too much at stake, so I took a tiny sip of my coffee, took a deep breath, and told him why I'd asked to meet him. He was transparently crestfallen when he discovered I was hot on the trail of a clue that might exonerate my son rather than taking a personal interest, but he recovered quickly and did his best to be helpful. "I left those bags out on the curb for the garbage truck to take away," said Martin. "Did you actually see the bags get thrown into the back of the truck?" Martin admitted he had not. What's more, a couple of neighborhood dogs had torn into one of the bags and strewn the contents everywhere. "Do you have any idea if the bag that got scattered was the one with the masks in it?" I asked. "My son-in-law was here fixing my dishwasher when it happened," Martin told me. "He cleaned everything up before I got home." At the book club meeting, I'd heard Martin speak of this son-in-law of his in glowing terms. He'd revealed that his son-in-law had recently had a windfall and financed a kitchen remodel for Martin. The combination of the son-in-law having an opportunity to get his hands on those masks and being flush with cash in quick succession was too striking to ignore. "How nice you have family nearby," I said. "Do you have just one daughter?" "She was an only child," said Martin, "but Gregory is like a son to me." "I'm glad they are so good to you," I said. "It's very generous of them to redo your kitchen for you." This got Martin off on a tangent on the minutiae of his remodel. I did not care much one way or the other which brands of laminate flooring held up to moisture, but I did very much care how Martin's son-in-law had managed to pay for enough of said quality laminate to redo Martin's kitchen. "How fortunate that your son-in-law had such unexpected good luck," I said. During the book club meeting, Martin had been exceedingly vague about the nature of his son-in-law's windfall. I did not for a second believe that Martin would have deliberately taken what amounted to blood money to finance his new refrigerator, but I was interested to know what his son-in-law had told him. "It wasn't luck," said Martin. "It was a bonus." "Bonus?" "He's a realtor," said Martin. "He had the highest total sales of his agency, so his boss gave him a bonus. Realtors work on commission. The more they sell, the more they earn. It seemed unlikely that the agency owner would pile a bonus on top of Gregory's commissions, but then I knew very little about being a realtor." "Tammy was so mad," said Martin. "Did my heart good to see Gregory get the best of her." "Who's Tammy?" I asked. "Tammy Danson. She lives across the street and she and Gregory work at the same agency. She's gotten that bonus for the last 3 years. Of course, she's always scheming to do someone dirty. I think she only lost because she was so distracted." "How so?" "She's trying to get custody of her grandkids." "Are their parents?" Chapter 15. I didn't know quite how to put the question delicately. What I meant to ask is if the mother and father of the grandchildren in question were unfit parents. "I misspoke," Martin said. "I should have said that she's trying to get her daughter full custody of the kids." We'd gone completely off the rails at this point. I knew more about the durability of laminate flooring than I'd ever need to know, and now we'd descended into some neighborhood gossip involving workplace intrigue and in-law interference. I was just about to force the conversation back on track when Martin said, "I suppose now that Frank is stuck in the hospital for a while and Tammy's got the kids at her house, it'll be even easier for her to make sure her daughter Tiffany gets full custody." "Frank?" Frank Vatu is Tammy's son-in-law. He and Tiffany split up about 6 months ago, and they've had joint custody up until now. Tammy tells anyone who'll listen that Frank is a terrible father, but I question that. To be honest, it seems like Tiffany dumps the kids at her parents' house every time she has them. I can't imagine Tiffany with full custody, although if Frank doesn't wake up soon, that's exactly what will happen. Why is Tammy so dead set against Frank keeping his kids? I asked. I think Tammy just has a vendetta against her son-in-law, but taking away a man's kid seems like a pretty cruel way of getting back at him. Back at him for what? Frank left Tammy for another woman. I left the perpetual grind with deep misgivings about Frank's relationship with his mother-in-law. I intended to do some more digging on both Greg and Tammy, but before I even made it back to Island Ice Cream to move a batch of mint chocolate chip out of the flash freezer before it got too hard, I had another pair to investigate. My phone rang just as I was passing by the nail salon. It was Linda. My mother says you were asking about those silly masks from the library fundraiser. Is it true they were used in the holdup? Unless there's another Richard Nixon and Dolly Parton mask floating around Wailuku, then yes, they must have been. My mom said she told you those masks got bagged up, and then Martin took the trash home with him, said Linda. Is that not true? I'm not sure that the masks made it all the way to Martin's. Oh? I think there's a good possibility that someone could have taken them out of the trash before Martin loaded the bags into his car. What makes you think that? I asked Linda. Because I saw someone going through the bags. Who? Trisha and Cliff, Linda said as if I should know who Trisha and Cliff were. Who? We were all talking about them during the book club meeting. To be fair, a large cross-section of the population of Wailuku Town had been discussed during the book club meeting. Refresh my memory, I said. They were the ones who just bought a brand new RV. Trisha and Cliff must be the couple who had recently been able to move out of their daughter's house. And no one is sure how they came up with the cash to do it? I asked. Trisha said something about inheriting some money, which I have no reason to question, said Linda. And I can't imagine them holding up a convenience store. They are the sweetest couple you'll ever meet. But I still thought you ought to know. Are they the type who'd normally rifle through the trash? Linda heaved a deep sigh. They are, she said. They've done it after every library fundraiser for the last 5 years. They claim it's because they're so green and can't bear to see things go to the landfill, but I think they've both got hoarding tendencies. Having hoarding tendencies and living in an RV was going to be a challenge. Do you know where Trisha and Cliff have their RV parked? I asked. Are you going to try and talk to them? I'd like to, but I won't be able to go until after work tomorrow. I'm just now leaving Island Ice Cream, and I need to get home and feed Ricks and Licks. Are Trisha and Cliff parked nearby? They have their RV parked in their daughter's backyard. Trisha and Cliff might have moved out, but they certainly hadn't moved away. I'll text you the address, and I'll go with you, but like I said, I'm absolutely certain Nate and Harmony would never have been mistaken for Cliff and Trisha, Linda told me. Still, they might know something about the masks, I said. I wanted to ask how Linda could be so adamant that the couple caught on the surveillance tape couldn't possibly be Trisha and Cliff, but I supposed that meeting the pair would probably reveal the reason. The following evening, Linda arranged for us both to drop by and visit Trisha and Cliff. Linda had framed our visit as a social call for her to come and admire Trisha and Cliff's new mobile abode. I told them I was bringing a friend with me who was new to town. I told them you were eager to meet new people. It was touching, somehow, to have Linda refer to me so casually as her friend. We'd barely gotten to know each other, but I supposed she was the closest thing I had to a friend in all of Wailuku Town. She clearly intended to take me under her wing. I supposed, in her own way, Linda's mother was also well on the way to becoming a friend. Alma Tanaka might be blunt and prickly on occasion, but there was no question that she was loyal and rather kind-hearted. underneath the forbidding exterior. If Auntie Alma decided she liked me, I'd have an ally for life. Unfortunately, as far as my standing with Mrs. Tanaka was concerned, I feared that the jury was still out. I wasn't terribly eager to meet new people. I'd met enough new people in the previous week to last me for months, but I was looking forward to meeting Trisha and Cliff. I had ulterior motives in wanting to meet the couple. I decided I'd be friendly but straightforward in questioning them about the masks. I could easily ask them if they'd seen the masks without accusing them of stealing them out of the fundraiser trash, wearing them to hold up Frank's filling station, shooting Frank, rendering him comatose, and then letting Nate and Harmony take the blame for their crime. I was not going to say any of that, and when I actually met Trisha and Cliff, I finally understood Linda's protestations that they couldn't possibly have been the couple caught on the surveillance camera as they came out of Frank's filling station. Trisha and Cliff were little people. "Linda didn't tell you, did she?" Trisha said, clearly catching on to the shock on my face. Trisha came up to my waist and Cliff wasn't much taller. "Don't worry about it," said Cliff. "Nobody expects us. You'll get used to it." He used a step stool to hoist himself up onto the built-in couch in the RV. Cliff and Trisha's new home was new, beautiful, and looked to have cost a fortune. It was also packed with piles of stuff, and they'd only just moved in. I tried not to imagine the pile of magazines towering over Trisha, collapsing and engulfing her tiny body. Chapter 16. "You poor thing," Trisha said when Linda explained that I was in Wailuku town to look after my son's business while he was being held without bail pending trial for a robbery none of his near and dear believed he'd committed. "You must be worried sick," said Cliff. "I was hoping you two might be able to confirm that the masks used in the holdup made it into Martin's car with the rest of the trash after the library fundraiser." "Masks?" Cliff asked. "What kind of masks?" It was infuriating to me that all the local coverage of the holdup seemed to have mentioned that the robbers were wearing masks, but not bothered to comment on their distinctive nature. If anything, the inclusion of the information that Frank Vatu had been shot by a couple impersonating the disgraced former President Nixon accompanied by the Queen of Country Music would have been amusing to many. Perhaps whoever had written the article had hesitated to insert such a comic detail into the account of such a horrific event. "They were full, pull-over-the-head style latex masks," said Linda. "Dolly Parton and Richard Nixon?" Trisha started laughing and Cliff joined her. They laughed until tears were streaming down their cheeks. I was suddenly feeling less judgmental about that delinquent journalist. Perhaps she had known what she was doing. "Did you see them?" Linda asked. "The robbers?" asked Cliff, regaining his composure a few seconds before his wife. "No, the masks," I said. "When?" Trisha asked. "When you were going through the bags of leftovers after the library fundraiser," said Linda. "The masks were donated for the rummage sale, but they hadn't sold and they weren't in very good shape, so my mom said they ended up with the stuff to be trashed." "We weren't going through any trash," said Trisha with a perfectly straight face. Was Trisha lying? I was quite certain Linda hadn't been when she'd claimed to have seen Trisha and Cliff going through the rummage sale leftovers. It wasn't as if Trisha and Cliff might be mistaken for anyone else either. "That wasn't trash," said Trisha. "Those were treasures." "Well, some of it was trash," said Cliff. "We didn't take—" "Much," said Trisha. "Just a wad of tangled tinsel garland and a little teapot that was missing its lid." They were begging to be rescued. She motioned in the direction of the little kitchen counter, which was covered with objects. One of the objects was the teapot in question, now filled with a little bouquet of paper flowers someone had crafted from an old newspaper. "But did you see the masks?" Linda persisted. "I didn't," said Cliff. "I didn't either," said Trisha. We'd only opened 2 of the bags when that Grace lady chased us off. She said we couldn't pick through the trash, said Tricia, making it sound as if Grace had issued a proclamation against breathing. Then some guy I didn't recognize started loading the bags into the back of his car. What did he look like? I asked. He was about my age, said Cliff. I was extremely hazy about how old Cliff was, but I didn't like to let on, so I asked if the man had any other distinguishing features. He had nice gray hair, said Tricia. Very handsome. Bright blue eyes. I didn't notice he was all that good looking, said Cliff. I certainly couldn't tell you what color his eyes were. What was he wearing? I persisted. Nice dark navy slacks and a light blue button-down with short sleeves, said Tricia. You certainly were paying close attention, said Cliff. I was betting both Alma and Grace remembered exactly what Martin had been wearing the day of the library rummage sale. I could ask them later, but it wasn't important. I was now satisfied that the leftovers from the rummage sale destined for the dump had all made it into the trunk of Martin's car. That meant the masks had likely disappeared after being set out on the curb at Martin's house. Before we left, Tricia and Cliff gave Linda and me a tour of their new place. It didn't take long. It was a very nice RV, and big as RVs go, but they were so far along on their way to filling it up with their possessions that it was hard to move around inside. It was so nice of my brother to finally buy me out, said Tricia. We couldn't have gotten this without that money. Buy you out? Linda said. There are 6 of us kids, said Tricia. We all inherited the family farm in Ohio when my mom passed away, but Eddie is the only one who wants to be a farmer, so he offered to buy us all out. Even if Cliff and Tricia's stature hadn't made it impossible that they could have been mistaken for Nate and Harmony, I'd still have had a hard time suspecting them of holding up Frank's filling station. Even if Cliff and Tricia had been suspicious characters, whatever cash Frank kept on hand wouldn't possibly be enough to finance a fancy rig like that. I told Linda so as we drove the mile back to our neighborhood. How much do you think an RV like that costs? I asked. Don't know. A lot. How much cash do you think the robbers might have gotten away with? I have no idea how much cash the robbers might have gotten away with, said Linda, but not nearly enough to buy a fancy RV. I wish I knew how much, I said. I know someone who could give you a pretty good idea, Linda told me. Who? Laura, Frank's niece. The girl who works at the filling station? That's the one. The first chance I got, I went back to Frank's in the hopes that Laura would be working. I was in luck. This time, I didn't bother filling up a basket of random food items so I could case the joint. Instead, I waited until Laura had finished waiting on the only other customer and got straight to the point. I'm Cynthia Rose, I told Laura. I'm Nate Rose's mother, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to me about what happened the day your Uncle Frank was shot. I half expected to be met with either hostility or skepticism, but instead, Laura seemed happy to be approached. My replacement comes in at 8, she told me. Let's meet at the Perpetual Grind at 8:15 and have a chat. The Perpetual Grind, like Frank's filling station, was open until midnight, so even though Laura was 15 minutes late getting there, I wasn't worried about getting kicked out before Laura was done telling me whatever it was she had to say. It would have been natural for Laura to refuse to speak to me, seeing as my son and his girlfriend were currently incarcerated for attempting to murder her uncle in cold blood, but her apparent eagerness to meet suggested to me that Laura was not entirely convinced that the police had picked up the right people. The first words out of her mouth confirmed my suspicions. I don't think they did it, Laura said before she'd even bothered to order. That made 2 of us. What makes you think that? I asked. Because I think someone else did. Who? Laura looked around to see who was in earshot. There were a couple of tourists, based on the pastiness of their bare legs sticking out from their cargo shorts, sitting several tables away. The barista had gone into the back for something. I would have thought that it was safe for Laura to voice her suspicions out loud, But apparently, she was more apprehensive about eavesdroppers than I was. Instead of naming names, she took a pen from her purse and scribbled on a napkin, then pushed it across the table to me. Tammy and Donald, the note read. I took out a pen of my own and wrote a question mark next to the names. Frank's in-laws, Lara wrote back. The Dansons? I wrote. Yes, said Lara, and put her finger to her lips in a warning that we must not say their names out loud. But why? They want the kids, said Lara. That squared with Martin's estimation of his neighbor's wishes, although he'd not suggested that Tammy Danson's desire to get her daughter full custody of their grandchildren might have motivated her to shoot her son-in-law. Do you have any evidence? I asked. Not a shred, said Lara. That's the problem. It's just a hunch, a very strong hunch. Would you be willing to go through everything you've been told happened the day of the robbery? I asked her. I would, said Lara, and I'll do one better. She again looked furtively around the coffee shop before reaching into her purse, withdrawing a flash drive and passing it across the table to me. I made you a copy, she said. The security camera footage? I asked. Such as it is, Lara told me. You know that someone had put tape over the inside camera and none of the others were working except the one over the back door into the alley? I did know that. Chapter 17. Would you mind showing me a picture of Nate and Harmony? Lara said. A full-body shot? I only saw the mugshots they printed in the newspaper. I flipped through the pictures on my phone until I came to one showing Nate and Harmony at the beach and handed my phone across to Lara. Your son and his girlfriend are several decades younger, but they have the same body types as... Lara paused without saying the Dansons' names, then continued. Do you happen to know what Nate and Harmony were wearing that day? I did not. Well, you'll see when you look at the footage, but they came out the front door of the filling station with the mask still on. The camera is very high up, so it's an overhead shot and doesn't capture height very well. Just out of curiosity, I said, do you have any idea how much was taken from the safe? I do, said Lara. I left about 20 minutes before it all went down, and I was the one who counted out the register and put the excess into the safe. We only keep about 150 in the register. How much was in the safe? I asked. Another 500 plus the jewelry. Jewelry? Frank keeps some personal stuff in the store safe. He had a few pieces of his late mother's jewelry in there. He was keeping them for when his daughter was old enough to appreciate it. What kind of jewelry? I asked. I don't remember very well, said Lara. He showed it to me only once. He kept it all in a little case in the back of the safe. What do you remember? There were a few gold chains, a solitaire diamond engagement ring, and a huge ruby cocktail ring. And it was all taken in the robbery? It must have been, said Lara, because it's gone now. The information about the jewelry was interesting, but Lara's insistence that there hadn't been more than $650 worth of cash in the store indicated that no one had gotten nearly enough out of the haul to be financing fancy RVS and kitchen remodels, not unless the robbers had managed to sell the rather ordinary-sounding jewelry for an unexpected sum. There wasn't much else that Lara could add to what I already knew about what had happened on the day Frank got shot. Do you think Frank would have recognized the robbers? I asked. There's no way of knowing, said Lara. But I have a feeling that if he would just wake up, your son and his girlfriend wouldn't be the ones awaiting trial. I hoped she was right, but there was no knowing if or when Frank would regain consciousness. And even if Frank were to wake up tomorrow, would he be able to tell us anything that would exonerate Nate and Harmony? It was nearly 9 by the time I left the perpetual grind, but I called Steve anyway. I have some new information, I told him. Can we meet? I'll be right over, Steve said. When he arrived, we sat on the front steps of the bungalow, and I filled him in on Pat finding the masks in the alley, the two possible pairs of suspects who didn't seem like suspects to me anymore, and everything Lara had told me. Steve didn't have much to add other than agreeing that despite Martin's daughter and son-in-law having access to the masks and finding themselves flush with cash soon after the robbery, they seemed unlikely to have held up Frank's filling station. He agreed with my complete rejection of Tricia and Cliff as suspects. "Before you go," I said, "shall we watch the security camera footage Lara gave me?" "I'm surprised she was so helpful," Steve said. That had been my initial reaction too, but she'd seemed sincere in her insistence that Tammy and Donald Danson must be behind the robbery. I set up my laptop on the coffee table in Nate and Harmony's tiny living room, and Steve and I watched the footage. "Could that be Harmony?" I asked Steve. "I don't believe it is, but yes, at that angle and with that mask on, I can see why the police are convinced they've got the right pair." The male half of the duo also could pass for Nate. It was highly unfortunate that Nate and Harmony had been caught cowering behind the dumpster when the police arrived. They hadn't had the masks on them when they'd been arrested, and now that I'd dug up a witness willing to go on record that the masks had been abandoned blocks away, that did puncture a little hole in the accepted narrative. Unfortunately, it was going to take more than Pat marching down to the police station, lugging her masked mannequins to get Nate and Harmony released from custody. As Steve was leaving, he paused on the steps of the bungalow. "I've meant to fix that loose step for ages," he said. "I've got a few tools in my car. I might as well do it while I'm here." I'd noticed that loose step the first time I'd gone down them. I usually remembered to skip over it, but it did need to be fixed, and I hadn't wanted to bother Alma about calling out a carpenter just to replace a few screws. "That would be great," I said. "I'll go get a flashlight so you can see." The light bulb on the front porch was burned out, and I'd not gotten around to changing it. I'd been making do after dark by using the light on my cell phone to navigate the rickety steps. Repairs seemed to call for a stronger light, however, and by the time Steve returned with his tools, I was positioned with a flashlight to illuminate the scene. "I'll take up the board and remove the old nails," said Steve. "After that, I can put in new screws." When he wrenched the few remaining nails free from the stringers and the light from my flashlight hit the cavity beneath the steps, my heart sank to my toes. "There's something down there," said Steve. That was stating the obvious, and his cheerful voice and reflexive move to pick it up indicated he hadn't yet recognized what it was. It was a small, old-fashioned velvet jewelry case of indeterminate color. The original color of the case was uncertain because it was badly singed. Someone had attempted to burn the case and then either failed or changed their mind and pulled the case from the flames. "Wait," I said. "That might be evidence." Evidence? I couldn't see Steve's expression without shining my flashlight into his face, but I could hear the alarm in his voice. "Let's just hope it isn't what we think it is," I said. "I'll go get a pair of rubber gloves from the kitchen and we'll have a look." The case contained what I feared it might. Inside were several gold chains and a diamond solitaire engagement ring. "Only the ruby cocktail ring is missing," I said, snapping the case shut without touching the contents. "What should we do?" Steve asked, his voice shaking. "Do you think someone's setting our kids up? Who would do that?" "The obvious answer is Tammy Danson," I said. "Or that's what Lara Vatu would like me to think." The timing was too obvious not to miss. Lara had been almost eager to tell me about the missing jewelry, although she hardly could have known that tonight was the night I'd discover it under the loose front step. As Steve and I were standing there, looking into the gaping hole where the board of the step used to be, my phone rang. Chapter 18. It was Laura. As I answered, I put the call on speaker so Steve could hear. "I forgot to tell you something about the money," she said. "When I counted out the cash from the register earlier the day of the robbery, I noticed that several of the bills had funny faces drawn on them." "What kind of funny faces?" "You know that silent film actor?" "The funny one." "Buster Keaton?" "I don't know his name." "He wears a funny round hat and striped pants. He's the one with the Hitler mustache." "Charlie Chaplin?" "That sounds right." Anyway, there were at least 3 ones that had George Washington altered to look like that Charlie guy. I just thought you might want to know. I did want to know, but it made me nervous. My heart believed in Nate and Harmony's innocence, but my mind still worried that the next time I was rooting around in Nate and Harmony's junk drawer in the kitchen, I might run across our nation's first president masquerading as a silent film star. "What do you think?" I asked Steve after I'd thanked Laura and ended the call. "I don't know what to think," he said. "Why would someone start to burn the jewelry and then change their mind at the last minute? Why is the ruby missing? Who hid the box under the porch?" There were a lot of questions and no answers. "I'm going to carry on with the assumption that it was neither Nate nor Harmony who hid that box under the step," I said. "I can't bring myself to do otherwise." "I can't either," said Steve. "Good. Then let's also assume, for the time being anyway, that Laura is telling the truth." Steve was less enthusiastic about trusting Laura, but he grudgingly agreed. "I'm not saying I believe Laura," I said. "It's just that finding the real robbers is going to be a process of elimination, and the only compelling suspects we have are Tammy and Donald Danson. Unless it was actually Laura who was behind the robbery, but neither Steve nor I voiced our misgivings out loud. Assuming Tammy and a male accomplice, likely her husband, held up Frank's, the motive probably wasn't money or Frank's mother's jewelry. It does seem likely they just wanted to kill Frank and make it look like a botched robbery. It may have just been a streak of good luck for the Dansons that the police picked up Nate and Harmony from the alley." Steve agreed with my line of reasoning. "Then their first instinct would be to get rid of their ill-gotten gains," I said. "I get your point about the jewelry," said Steve. "But is cash really traceable?" "The defaced bills would be," I said. "What about the rest?" "Probably not," I admitted. "But they'd have definitely tried to unload the jewelry as soon as possible." "By burning it?" "It looks like someone tried." "And changed their mind," Steve said. "Or someone stopped them. So they could plant it as evidence to implicate Nate and Harmony?" "Possibly," I said. "Do people around here have fireplaces?" "A few really old houses do, but mostly up in the hills." "So they'd have likely tried to burn the jewelry outside?" "Probably. In a backyard fire pit. Wouldn't burning up a bunch of metal jewelry into an unrecognizable form take a long time?" "I'm sure it would," said Steve. "But a few old places have burn barrels. Some of the older generation still get rid of their trash that way, although it's discouraged." "Let's explore that possibility," I said. "By driving around looking for places with burn barrels?" I could see that Steve didn't think much of this apparently scattershot approach. What I had in mind was compiling a list of Tammy's friends and relations who might have one. "A burn barrel?" "Yes, preferably friends and relations who are unlikely to inquire too closely into what Tammy might be up to." "How do you propose to do that?" "I'll start with Tammy's neighbor, Martin. He's extremely talkative and hard to keep on the subject, but I didn't mention that part." "Do you want me to go with you?" Steve asked. I wasn't convinced that Martin really had a thing for me, but although I might not have mentioned it already, Harmony's father was rather easy on the eyes and had a certain charm that I was quite sure that Martin would view as competition. "I don't need you to go with me to have a chat with Martin," I said. "He's completely harmless, but when it comes to acting on any information he might be able to give me, I'll be happy for the company." "What about Laura?" Steve asked. Wouldn't she know a lot about Tammy's connections? She probably does, but let's see how far we can get without cluing her into what we're doing. The next morning, before I went to open up Island Ice Cream, I tried to quiz my immediate neighbors as to whether they'd seen anyone unusual hanging around. Assuming someone had planted that jewelry box under the front porch step, they'd have had to do it when I wasn't around. Or at least Rix wasn't. Rix is not at all vicious. He wouldn't know a villain from Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of pets. But Rix never fails to bark when someone approaches, even if it's just a brief friendly outburst before he goes back to sleep. Alma was not at home. She gets an early start to her day, and I decided I could catch her later. When I knocked on the other side of the duplex, Dan answered the door. I felt awkward about asking for a favor after all the drama with Zoe and her hate campaign against Mrs. Tanaka, but there was too much at stake to avoid speaking to them just because I'd been the catalyst for a great deal of unpleasantness. Dan came to the door unshaven and with a cup of coffee in his hand. "I hate to disturb you so early in the morning," I said, "but I have reason to believe there's been someone bothering Nate and Harmony's place." "Bothering? You mean like vandalism?" "More like stealing," I said. Planting of stolen goods was more like it, but I didn't want to go into all the sordid details. The fewer people who knew about that jewelry, the better. So I left it at that. Dan's face fell. "I don't for a minute think it has anything to do with you or Zoe. I may even know who it is," I said. "I was just hoping you might have seen a stranger coming and going." "Stranger? Someone you don't recognize." "I haven't," said Dan. "But then I'm gone to work most of the day." "Thanks," I said, and was about to leave when Dan hollered for Zoe, who skulked out of her bedroom still wearing yellow Hello Kitty pajamas and purple bunny slippers. "Auntie Cynthia is wondering if you've seen anyone you didn't recognize hanging around here." "When?" Zoe asked. She wasn't making eye contact, but she didn't look mad so much as in danger of falling asleep again, so I took that as a hopeful sign. "When?" Steve asked. I wasn't sure when. It was hard to know when that jewelry had been planted under the front step of the bungalow. "Sometime since Nate and Harmony got arrested," I said. "It was possible that whoever had planted that jewelry had done so in hopes that when the police searched the place, they'd find it, which alerted me to the fact that I didn't know if or when such a search had taken place. I couldn't imagine that the police would have arrested Nate and Harmony and then not searched their bungalow for evidence. I decided that was another question I needed to ask Alma. Surely she'd know. "How long ago were they arrested?" Zoe asked. "A little over 3 weeks ago," I said. "I did see someone strange," Zoe said. "I don't remember when it was, but I know it was after they arrested Nate and Harmony. I saw a guy delivering food. I thought it was weird, but I figured he'd just gotten the wrong address." "Tell me exactly what happened," I said. "I was up on the roof of the shed drawing," said Zoe, "when this guy came into the yard. Was Rix here?" "I think Auntie Linda already had Rix at her house." "Tell me what happened," I said. "I didn't notice there was this guy in the backyard," Zoe told me, "until he was up on your steps knocking on the front door. He was carrying a stack of takeout boxes in a plastic bag, so I figured he was just a delivery guy who'd gotten the address wrong. I was about to yell down that nobody was living there when he started acting weird." "Weird how?" "He left the bag of takeout on the front mat and started poking around under the porch like he was looking for something. Then he started to walk around the house, trying windows like he was going to break in. It kind of creeped me out." "Was your dad home?" "No, Auntie Alma was, but I think we all knew why Zoe had been loath to involve Mrs. Tanaka regardless of how creeped out she'd been. But I didn't feel like forcing the kid to revisit her delinquent past, so I said, "What happened next?" "This guy hadn't noticed me up on the roof of the shed, so I kind of slithered over onto the roof of the house so he couldn't see me and then threw the apple I was eating at him." "Did you hit him?" I asked.
This is the end of part 2. Check the Mangoes and Malice playlist on this channel for the remaining 2 parts.